Seth, thank you so much, and thanks to all of you. And it is such a pleasure to be here with you in the audience and everybody watching online. And it's a pleasure to be here with the two people who will share the stage, who I'll introduce in a second, to discuss and debate the question, should the United States continue to view Russia as an adversary? And as Seth said, this is an interactive event. You have to participate. So use the QR code to answer that question now, however you feel about it, and also use that same QR code to ask us questions for later in the evening. You know, it's a topic that is at the top of the news every day, given the ongoing war in Ukraine and the attempts to end that war. But it is also, as we will hear tonight from our panelists, a question that I think we will all agree will help determine the future of Ukraine, Europe, the future of the transatlantic alliance, the future of human rights and accountability. And it is also a question that will get at the kind of world that we will want to live in, because it will extend to nuclear weapons and it will extend from Washington to Moscow into Beijing as well. So let me introduce our panel. Tom Graham is a distinguished fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. His last government job was during the George W. Bush administration as special assistant to the president and senior director for Russia on the National Security Council staff. And Evelyn Farkas is the executive director of the McCain Institute at Arizona State University. During the Obama administration, she was the deputy assistant secretary of defense for Russia, Ukraine, Eurasia, and before that, the senior advisor to the Supreme Allied Commander Europe. So let us welcome our panelists tonight. So, Evelyn Farkas, won or lost, I don't know, the coin toss in the back.
Ladies first.
Yes, and so you get to go first, and you get the big question. Should the United States continue to view Russia as an adversary?
Absolutely, yes. For two reasons. First of all, Vladimir Putin himself has characterized the West as an adversary. He has told his own people that they are fighting in Ukraine against the West. He very clearly in 2014, when he seized Crimea illegally, counter to international law, the first annexation, the first Anschluss that we've seen since the end of World War II, he put out a vision for a neo-imperial Russian, new Russian empire, a new Russian world that would include the former Soviet states. And frankly, if he can get away with it, he would like to extend his influence all the way into the former Eastern Bloc and frankly, weaken Western Europe and the United States. We also know this, not just because of his words, but because of his actions. And now I don't even have enough time to go through the long list. And I used to give these speeches and I'd call them the litany of the lamentables because I like the alliteration. But it starts with invading Georgia in 2008. Again, counter to international law. They're still occupying 20% of Georgia's territory. Then 2014, I already mentioned the annexation, but they started another conflict in Donbass, which is where most of the fighting is going on right now. In addition to that, again, long list of things that they've done to break international law. They broke conventional and nuclear arms control agreements with the United States and our European allies. They have conducted, they shot down an aircraft, the MH17 aircraft over Ukrainian airspace and did not take responsibility. They have, I'm going to try to just focus on the worst ones that demonstrate that they really are out to get us and weaken us. They've attacked our elections. They've attacked the elections of Eastern European countries, Western European countries, and frankly, all over the world. They have tried to weaken the United States by pitting us against one another, but they've also influenced people in our political system. They've used data that they received from Cambridge Analytica, for example, to target American citizens through Facebook and other social media in 2016. Since then, they have not stopped trying to influence our elections. There's a lot of Russian money that we don't even know about that's slushing around our economy. They want a weak America that cannot counter Putin's vision of this neo-imperial Russia and a sphere of influence system. And this is the crux of why Ukraine matters, because we're not supporting Ukraine because we just love Ukraine. We are supporting Ukraine because Ukraine stands for everything that has kept us safe and prosperous since the end of World War II. This international order, which is basically a deal that the great powers made. We will respect the borders of the states as they exist at the end of World War II. In exchange, you will take care of the people. You will abide by human rights. That's another aspect where Russia has been incredibly, I don't even know what the word is, because they have violated the human rights of Ukrainians, but before that, the Syrians and the Chechens, deliberately targeting civilians. So to call them anything but an adversary, I think, is to be naive. Sorry.
So, Tom Graham, is Russia pursuing a neo-imperial order, neo-imperial agenda, abrogating international order, breaking arms control, interfering with elections in order to weaken the United States? And it would be naive to use any word other than adversary.
Let me say that I agree with Evelyn. Russia is an adversary, and that shouldn't be surprising. The United States and Russia have been rivals from the moment the United States emerged as a major power at the very end of the 19th century. We're divided by worldviews. We're divided by geopolitical interests. What I find disturbing and worrying at this point is the depth of the animosity between our two countries, something that we haven't seen, I would argue, since the darkest days of the Cold War. And it is a relationship now that is fraught with the risk of direct military confrontation between our two countries, an escalation perhaps to a catastrophic nuclear level. And so that, I think the task for the United States is not to reset this relationship, not to build a broad partnership with Russia. What Russia has done in Ukraine and a number of other things that Evelyn has already mentioned preclude that. The task, to my mind, is actually something more modest, and that is to try to take this adversarial relationship and transform it into what I would call a relationship of competitive coexistence. That is a relationship where we responsibly manage the differences between our two countries, where we try to shift the competition away from the military realm as much as possible into the economic, the commercial, the cultural, the diplomatic, the ideological, and so forth. And also find the opportunity to cooperate on what we would call a narrow range of transnational interests, where cooperation between our two countries is indispensable. Strategic stability, you can't do that without Russia. The non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, again, much easier to do if you're working with Russia. Climate change is something that we will never master without the participation of Russia. So competitive coexistence, it's like the relationship we had with Russia in the early 20th century. A more recent example might be détente of the 1970s, stripped of the ideological overlay. It's what I call a normal relationship between great powers that we've seen throughout history, particularly at times of peace and relative stability. Now, the Trump administration is trying to move away from this, to move off the adversarial relationship. I give them credit for trying to open up a dialogue with Russia. But as you can see, we're far from a stable equilibrium at this point, far from competitive coexistence. And if some of the things that we've seen over the past couple of days continue, we'll be back in the adversarial relationship.
Evelyn Farkas, post-Ukraine full-scale invasion, see the United States go back to détente with Russia and Vladimir Putin?
Not with Vladimir Putin. I think that's the problem. So I do agree with Tom that it would be far more desirable to have this kind of relationship where we are competitive, but we understand what the rules of the road are, kind of the way that we had it during the Cold War, during détente, where we were trying to take down the temperature, we had arms control. I actually do think that maybe preempting a future question, but I do think that we should have arms control. We should try to have those discussions with the Russians, even in this adversarial situation. But the reality is that Vladimir Putin does not see any way to cooperate with us, and we have tried certainly since President Clinton, President Bush, and then President Obama. Every president except for President Biden has tried to work competitively but cooperatively with Russia, and it ended up, I was in the Obama administration, we had a very narrow lane where we got a few things done, but actually there was less there than even what we talked about, for example, counterterrorism cooperation. We, in the Obama administration, talked about cooperation with Russia, but frankly, I happen to know there wasn't very much counterterrorism cooperation going on unless it was in the narrow interest of the Russians at the time. So if there's a narrow interest where Vladimir Putin and the United States can come together and work on something, and it might be arms control, because right now we have our president talking about a golden dome, which is alarming the Russians and maybe motivating them to talk about strategic arms control, because there's nothing more dangerous in the world today, more dangerous than AI, is AI and nuclear. So we still have to solve the problem of nuclear arms and what humans can do and what AI might do. So I would argue that we can only have that situation if we have a ruler in Russia, a leadership that is interested in having that kind of stable competitive relationship, but that is not what Vladimir Putin has set out as his goal.
Tom Graham, if Putin at his core strategy does want to see a United States that has less influence today, or less influence in the future than it does today, why should the United States government try and find things to align with Vladimir Putin?
Well, look, I mean, the fact of the matter is this country is not going to go away, and it is going to be a rival. There's not going to be a democratic revolution in Russia anytime that makes sense from the policy standpoint. The country is not going to break up. The economy is not going to collapse, no matter what we do on the sanctions side. It's going to remain the type of country it has been historically. It's authoritarian in its political system. It's expansionary in its foreign policy impulse. It lags behind the United States, and it has the West generally, economically, technologically, and it is a country that insists that it has to be treated as a great power on the global stage. So yes, it's a difficult country to deal with, but it matters in the ways I've already talked about. You can't do strategic stability without the Russians. You can't do climate change without the Russians. And so we're going to have to find a way to work with this country. It does a lot of things that are contrary to our interests, and we can talk about this later, and we need to resist that in some way. But the diplomatic element to it is also critical, of trying to find ways to cooperate that advance our interests. Now, the way I think about this is that the goal is not so much to undermine Russian power over the long term. It's to find ways to harness Russia's power and interest to the advancement of American national interest. And those are things, I think, through creative diplomacy, you can do when you're thinking about the Middle East, when you're thinking about the Arctic, when you're thinking about the broader relationship with China. And I think there are ways of manipulating the work with Russia to get to the type of outcome we would like to see in Ukraine and the type of security arrangements that we would like to see in Europe going forward.
It's an interesting way to put it, not undermine Russian interests, but instead harness Russian interests. I know you'll disagree with that, but let me zoom in, because we're going to go around the world a little bit right now. We already have dipped into a little bit, but we need to talk about the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And that point that Tom just made about whether the U.S. policy should be undermining Russian interests or harnessing it, I think will come back again and again. Let's talk about root causes. So Russia talks about root causes of the war in Ukraine as part of its negotiation. It did before the full-scale invasion, when it was negotiating with the Biden administration in December 2021, and continues to talk about it today. Evelyn Farkas, if Russia maintains previous demands or previous definitions of the root causes of the war, presence of U.S. troops in Eastern Europe, Ukraine and Georgia from joining NATO, and that needs to be blocked, and the size of Ukraine's military, which needs to be capped. So, removal of some U.S. troops from Eastern Europe, block Ukraine and Georgia from joining NATO, cap the size of the Ukraine's military. Is that a peace worth pursuing?
I don't think so, because you're giving Russia then a veto on the sovereignty, on the rights of the Georgian people, the Ukrainian people and their governments, as well as all the NATO allies, to decide whether those countries should be part of NATO. Why should Russia have a veto on that? So I don't agree with that. And I also think, as to the size of the Ukrainian military, I mean, that might be part of a compromise, maybe. It would depend on what else would be involved. I would say, if you're going to limit the size of the Ukrainian military, well, then you better make sure you let them into NATO. But the fact of the matter is that Ukraine is the most capable, interoperable European military on the continent today, save the United States, because we are on the European continent as well. But as a European military power, there's a joke, that well, I'm going to get it wrong. So anyway, but the point is, what's the biggest, anyway, the largest military force?
You mean the Ukrainians say
I'm gonna get it wrong with
what it used to be is who's the second biggest or the second largest military in the world? That was Russia.
Yes.
What is the second largest or second best military in Ukraine? The Russians.
Yes.
That's the joke that the Ukrainians.
Thank you for saving me.
Yeah.
I should never try to tell jokes.
No. Okay, so Tom Graham, you know where I'm going with this, and you laughed because you knew what I was trying to do. Why do you think it's so important to engage with Russia's quote-unquote root causes when you see this instinctual response that so many people in Washington and the West give?
Because at the end of the day, what you want to secure is some stability in Europe. This conflict in Ukraine is going to draw a line between Russia and the West. It runs from the Barents Sea through the Baltic Sea, and it's going to run across Ukrainian territory into the Black Sea. And the goal that we should be focused on is, how are we going to stabilize that? And you won't be able to do that without taking Russian interest into account. That doesn't mean you appease Russian interest. It means that they have to be part of the negotiating process as well. Now, those three questions you asked, I don't think that the United States should withdraw its military forces from Europe at this point, even if the Trump administration is thinking about it. I think they're critical to undergirding deterrence in Europe. I don't think that we should have restrictions on the level of the Ukrainian military force unless they are reciprocal, and that the Russians accept those as well. And I could see that developing as a longer-term process of trying to stabilize and then diffuse the tensions along this long border. But that's not something for the immediate term. Where I would disagree with Evelyn is on the question of NATO. I think, as a practical matter, NATO is not going to expand further eastward. I think we've made it very clear over the past decade or beyond that we are not prepared to go to war against Russia to defend Ukraine. If you bring them into NATO, that's the obligation you're undertaking. And if we're not prepared to do it for Ukraine, we're not going to do it for Belarus, which is pretty much a Russian vassal state. We're not going to do it for Moldova, which has permanent neutrality written into its constitution. And the three Caucasian states are simply, I think, for many people, beyond the borders of Europe. So it isn't going to happen. And I think, as a practical matter, and again, in exchange for something else that you might want out of the Russians in a negotiation, to back away from this open door policy and say, realistically, it isn't going to happen. Why do we have to adhere to this principle if it has no real meaning in the real world and actually complicates what our real goal should be, is of stabilizing this border over the next 10, 15 years.
Evelyn Farkas, what is the best way to achieve that stability, and can the U.S. close the open door?
It's really about deterrence, because the reason you include these countries in NATO is so that they're under the conventional and nuclear collective security umbrella, so that Russia is not tempted to invade them. And frankly, I will never say Russia will never become a democracy. I will never say that we won't see a change in Russia in the near future. I will never say that the Federation won't fragment, because we don't know. We're not good at predicting what happens inside Russia, and when change comes, it comes suddenly. And also, I've watched the process, and I've been part of getting Montenegro, for example, into NATO. Many people said, I mean, in the administration when I was there, they were opposed, and we got it through. And there's a whole long, wonderful story about that. Now, Montenegro is not a perfect country. In many ways, they would have more trouble getting in today than they did then. But nevertheless, Russia's highly unlikely to attack Montenegro, to use little gray forces, green men, you know, to sabotage, although they are now flirting with the idea of sabotage in other places, which I didn't have a chance to mention, because there are many more things that Russia's doing that are dangerous to the United States and our European allies. I also didn't talk about cyber threats, and to our critical infrastructure. But I think the important point is that NATO was conceived, the post-Cold War expansion of NATO, when the Warsaw Pact fell apart, and I must say now I'm Hungarian American, so I was watching this very closely. And at the time, I actually didn't think it was a great idea to expand, because I thought it would dilute the collective security, just as you were saying, that we're not going to defend Hungary. Now, maybe that's not the best example to use today, but Poland. And Ukraine, of course, can provide very good Article 3, which is ability to defend your own country under the NATO Charter, defense. Now, the reason we actually kept going with the expansion was not just because the Czechs, the Hungarians, you know, all of those countries felt threatened by Russia, but we actually in the United States felt like it was a way of increasing economic investment and stability. So I actually think NATO expansion brings stability and it deters Russia. And that's why I will not close that open door with my words.
NATO brings deterrence and stability even as it extends to Russia's border.
Look, I mean, we expanded NATO in the post-Cold War, never thinking that we would have to honor Article 5. We were cooperating when trying to cooperate with Russia when that first wave of expansion occurred. The same thing was true of the expansion in 2004, the Big Bang that brought in a lot of East European countries, including the Baltic states. The only two countries that we brought into NATO with the sense that it was critical to defense are Finland and Sweden, because they actually had the capabilities at the time of their admission that would help NATO deal with this function going forward. You know, Ukraine lies in a different realm, I think, for the Russians. And I think, you know, we should not underestimate the place that Ukraine occupies in Russia's political imagination. Whether you agree with the history or not, Russians believe it's the cradle of their civilization. It has been a critical buffer zone for Russia. It has been an essential source of Russian power over the past century. Little known fact, at the end of the 19th century, without Ukraine, the Russian Empire would not have been a great power. That's where that was the industrial heartland of the Russian Empire. And so the idea that if you simply bring them into to NATO, that the Russians are going to give up and not attack, I think, is something that at least we ought to interrogate and ask ourselves the question about that. Was NATO expansion important in bringing stability to Eastern Europe? I would agree, yes. It helped, I think, reinforce democracy in Eastern Europe. So I'm not necessarily opposed to it, but I think when we look at this now and going forward and the impact it's going to have on Russia, the circumstances are different, and we need to ask the hard questions about what we're prepared to do under what circumstances.
One more about Ukraine, and then we'll move to somewhere where you guys will agree wholeheartedly. Evelyn Farkas, should the negotiations include not only the United States and Russia at the table, but Ukrainians and Europeans?
Absolutely. First of all, you should not negotiate Ukraine's future without Ukraine at the table. And that's been a consistent policy throughout multiple U.S. administrations since the war started in 2014. Second, the Europeans have provided CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and the numbers are all over the place, so I'm just going to give the rough outline. They've said about 2/3 of the overall assistance that's been provided to Ukraine has come from the Europeans, EU and other European states that are not in EU. So they deserve a seat at the table. The other reason is because if Putin is allowed to keep Ukraine, if you will. He's not going to stop. Remember, he has a neo-imperial agenda. He's going to get Georgia, he's going to get Moldova, and then he's going to turn to those Baltic states. He's going to try to destroy NATO by testing Article 5 and taking more land. He's not the type of leader who's going to stop. He actually has a war machine that he needs to keep going. So the danger to the Europeans means that they deserve a right to the table as well.
Tom Graham, can you accomplish what you are imagining is important to accomplish, that stability between the United States and Russia, if at the table is Ukraine and Europe?
The question is whether it's a real table or metaphorical table. Look, I mean, I think for a whole host of reasons, the key channel has to be Moscow and Washington. Russia respects us as a power. They're prepared to talk to us in well, not necessarily constructive terms, but real terms. Adding Ukraine physically at the table, I think, complicates that matter. Bringing in the Europeans further complicates that matter. But go back to the Cold War, where the main axis of negotiation was between Washington and Moscow. But we undertook to consult thoroughly with our allies before any summit meeting with the Russians and debrief them thoroughly after. And so their ideas, their interests were brought into those negotiations. And that's the way I look at the negotiations over bringing a conclusion to the Russia-Ukraine war, but also this broader question of how we're going to stabilize the European continent. United States in the lead, but we have to be in close consultation with the our European allies, our Ukrainian partners. And at the end of the day, there is no deal unless the Ukrainians sign on, unless the Europeans sign on. So it's a practical matter of how best to conduct a negotiation to get to a result that satisfies your interest, is acceptable to our, as I said, our Ukrainian partners and our European allies.
So I just want to put a point.
And I don't actually disagree with that, if I could just say. The only question is whether we're still a trusted interlocutor. That's the key part.
I want to put a point on arms control. You guys have both brought it up. How important is it, Evelyn, you start, that DC and Moscow start negotiating an extension of New START, which places verifiable limits on U.S. and Russian deployed intercontinental ballistic missiles, and expires in February? Why is it important that those negotiations happen?
I think it's important, first of all, to demonstrate to the world that we still face an existential threat posed by Russia's nuclear forces, that there is still a standoff between the United States and Russia that could destroy both of our countries and wreak havoc on other countries as well. And that needs to be managed. And I think it would help us get to another world where there's another leadership in Russia that might be more constructive. And there are actors inside of Russia who I've engaged with in their foreign ministry who know how to do this and can do it and can help bridge, again, to another time when we might have a more constructive leader. But we do have to take down the temperature and limit the threat posed by strategic nuclear weapons. It's only one piece of the puzzle because, as the Trump administration pointed out and tried to expand the pie, China is a problem now. They're growing their nuclear arsenal, and we want to also deter them. But I think that it's asking too much. They failed in trying to come up with, and also the Biden administration, trying to come up with a way to create strategic stability that also included China, not to mention Pakistan, India, and other countries that are also growing their arsenals. We need to start with Russia because that's where we have the parity, that's where their largest forces are. And frankly, again, with this Golden Dome and missile defense threat that our president has posed to Russia, it's an opportunity to get them to the table.
Tom Graham, quickly, because I want to move to China afterward. Can we have that dialogue, given there's a date on the calendar at which New START expires, in the current environment?
I think the short answer to that question is yes. But it's not going to be an extension of START 2. I think bilateral arms control agreements between Russia and the United States as the foundation of strategic stability are largely dead. It doesn't mean that we don't need some sort of mechanism to regulate our nuclear forces to maintain strategic stability. But as Evelyn has already indicated, the strategic equation, the strategic landscape has grown much more complicated over the past decade is not only a matter of China and other nuclear powers, it is the development of missile technology, precision-guided conventional weapons, cyberspace, which all has strategic consequences. Yeah. So it's a much more difficult equation. One of the reasons that I argue for these conversations between Russia and the United States is we are the two countries that have the deepest historical experience in conceptualizing strategic stability. That is something that we could work out together and then spread it beyond to the other strategic actors around the globe.
Beijing and Moscow have what they call a no-limits partnership. There's a debate about whether there actually are limits, but nonetheless, you have strategic alignment today between Xi and Putin, and stated in multiple joint statements since right before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Evelyn Farkas, if Washington and Moscow had a better relationship, could that help the U.S. confront Beijing?
I don't see how that would work, because I mean, a better relationship would mean if Russia had a leader that was more constructive and not as adversarial against the West, which China will do everything to prevent at this moment in time, because right now China has also decided that we're the adversary, and Russia is very useful to China in this current context because Russia is making America weaker. I mean, Russia is every day, I mentioned all the things they're doing, they're making our alliances also weaker. It's not just in the NATO context. Our East Asian allies are looking and saying, is the United States reliable? Is the United States going to be with us? And so that is also benefiting China directly. Now, we've seen some changes where our allies, for example, in the Philippines, we've done more to bolster those relationships, and with Australia, et cetera, so the deterrence against China is better and we're working better together. But the Chinese want the Russians to do everything they can to weaken us, because that benefits China.
Tom Graham, same exact question. If Washington and Moscow had a better relationship, could that help the U.S. confront Beijing?
Short answer is yes. But I also think that there is some unease in Moscow about the nature of the relationship with China at this point. They talk about unlimited partnership at this point, but the Russians are disappointed that the Chinese haven't invested more in Russia. They are disappointed that the Chinese don't cut them any slack in commercial deals. They're stealing their energy. They're not buying it the way the Russians would want to. And I think this asymmetry in power and fortune between the two countries gnaws at the Russians because it undermines their own sense of themselves as a great power. You can't be a great power if you lack strategic autonomy and you are entirely in China's embrace. And so what I find interesting in the conversations that I have with my Russian counterparts is this desire to find a counterbalance to China. And I suspect that this is an element in Putin's thinking as well, that he wants to normalize relationship with the United States as a way of rebalancing his relationship with China. That doesn't mean he's going to disrupt it, but he wants to have the leverage that he doesn't have. We talk about a reverse Kissinger in this country. What I find interesting, I think that Putin wants to play Kissinger. He wants to recreate the US-Russia leg of the triangle, use improved relationship with Washington as a way of giving him leverage with Beijing, and in his mind, improving Russia's position with China. Does that work to our advantage in dealing with China? I think absolutely. It's not a rupture. It's not a coalition against the Chinese, but it creates a situation in which the deals that Russia and China sign are not tilted so heavily in China's favor. That is advantageous to us as we try to deal with a complicated strategic equation, particularly in the Indo-Pacific.
Evelyn Farkas, are you convinced?
The price is too high. The price is too high because what Russia wants is to take apart the international order and to get away with murdering civilians, deliberately targeting women in hospitals, in maternity wards in Ukraine, UN convoys in Syria, and residential settlements in Chechnya. I mean, these are things that the Russian government has done and has not been held accountable and has continued to do over and over again, which means they won't be deterred. But that price is too high for the United States in terms of our interests and our values.
Is it too high to give up values and interests?
Look, we don't get there as long as the Russia war against Ukraine is continuing. I think if you understand where Putin's coming from, that desire to rebalance against China does actually give you some leverage in the negotiation with the Russians. Peace in Ukraine, the preservation of a sovereign and independent Ukraine is a key U.S. national interest. It's important to European stability. We need to talk to the Russians in order to get there. We need to bring them to the table. But no one's talking about, at least I'm not talking about, forgetting about all this, pushing this to the side, because if we have a constructive relationship with the Russians, we buy something in the relationship with the China. This is a package. Normalization doesn't come without substantial progress in dealing with the problems of Russia, Ukraine.
And I would just add, while I agree with that, the way to get there is not to talk to them, it's to actually put pressure on them, to threaten them. It's not what can we discuss with them and agree with them. It's the way that Putin will respond is the way these types of leaders, I've seen it also in the Balkans, is pressure and threats. The Golden Dome is an example.
Well, you got to my last question, which was going to be, Tom Graham, what happens? Evelyn Farkas says, I mean, we use this in terms of context of deterrence, but most experts want Trump to pressure Putin because they think that will lead to a better deal or a more likely deal in Ukraine. Is that correct? What is the response to economic or military pressure?
Points here. First, the relationship with Russia has to be one of deterrence and dialogue. So I am in favor of continuing to support Ukraine. I don't necessarily think that sanctions is the way to go. What I would like to see the administration do is pass a supplemental that would demonstrate that we're prepared to provide, along with our European allies, the wherewithal the Ukrainians need to push back against Russian aggression and to protect its airspace from attack. I would like to see the administration abandon this idea that its goal is to mediate between the Russians and the Ukrainians and take up the role of leader of the West, of a united West, because we have an interest in this conflict. But that has to be part of a dialogue, is an important part of bringing the Russians on board in this way. So deterrence plus dialogue, I think, leads to an outcome that we can accept, that the Ukrainians can accept. But just one sort of point here. I think we need to understand realistically that this is going to be an ugly peace if we get there. This is not a case where justice is going to be produced. Putin is not going to be hauled off to The Hague. Russia is going to end up occupying a certain amount of Ukrainian territory. I think our goal, as I said, preserve the independence and sovereignty of Ukraine, give it the best possible position so that it can act on its Euro-Atlantic ambitions and grow its country and make it into a prosperous country over time. Look at Finland, for example. So if we focus too much on the question of justice in the way we think about it in moral terms, we are going to lose the opportunity to produce an outcome that will make life better for millions and millions of Ukrainians.
Well, justice and accountability is a huge issue in Ukraine and for critics of Russia, obviously. And that brings us to your questions. And the first one, Evelyn, you'll have to answer this. What degree of damage was brought on by, and this is, I'm just reading the question, by Biden and Obama's inability to hold Russia accountable?
I think a lot. Unfortunately, in the Obama administration, even though there were those of us, including myself, arguing for a robust military, lethal capability for Ukraine and quick action to stop certain things that Russia was doing, for example, going into Syria, the Obama administration was focused on longer-term challenges, or at least at the time they seemed longer-term, medium to long-term, like China, and also the situation in the Middle East that was still ongoing with Syria, and in Africa with the terrorist organizations that we were helping our partners defeat or fight. And so Russia just seemed like a problem many people didn't want to deal with. And I think that in both administrations, but I'm going to include the Trump administration, though I give them credit for, and I give President Trump credit for approving the lethal defensive assistance that we had been advocating for in my office in the Obama administration.
You're talking about the first Trump decision.
The first Trump
to send
administration.
javelins, which ended up saving Kyiv
Correct,
many
because
years later.
they're anti-tank weapons, which deters the Russians from sending their tanks across the border, again, in multiple ways. So the reality was that we didn't recognize how serious Putin was. We could have deterred him by giving more and better assistance quicker to the Ukrainians on all fronts. We did everything in a staggered fashion, incrementally. We were always afraid of some kind of reaction. And then under the Biden administration, it became even more exacerbated when it should have been clearer. And we should have provided a massive deterrent effort to Ukraine in April, before the February 2022 invasion, because already that previous April, the Russians were lining up, sort of practicing for the full frontal invasion. And we were already, I know, because the diplomacy had, people flying all over, I won't name them, because I love them, but, they should have been much more proactive and engaged in deterring Russia. And all along I think the Biden administration was much better at deterring, because they were the same people. They had learned from the Obama experience that you can't just react. You have to try to prevent.
Tom Graham, what degree of damage was brought on by Biden and Obama's inability to hold Russia accountable? And I will add, there's people who believe Trump has also chosen not to hold Putin accountable, especially for the 2016 election.
Okay. I didn't work for the Biden administration or the Obama administration, but I actually say some good words about him or try to put it in a different context. If you look at where the United States was in the late 2000s, the early 2010s, we thought our two greatest national security challenges were proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and international terrorism. Crimea was an act of aggression. I agree. I think the Obama administration probably should have pushed back harder against that. But I think in the mind of the president at that time, I had two things I was worried about: Iran nuclear, and I needed the Russians, and the Russians played an instrumental role in getting the Iran deal in 2015, and ISIS. And all of a sudden, I needed the Russians to deal with ISIS in Syria. And so he made a calculation, right one or wrong one we can debate, but given the way he saw the national security challenges to the United States, I'm going to go easier on Russia because I want to leverage them to deal with these two real challenges.
And as I think he said to Jeffrey Goldberg at The Atlantic as he was leaving office, we will never care about Crimea and Ukraine as much as Putin.
Exactly. So a very sort of realist.
Right.
Where I think where I would fault American administrations is that we never put enough pressure, enough effort into the democratization in Ukraine itself. And we are concerned about Russia's expansionary tendencies. If you look at history, Russian expansion stops when it runs up against well-ordered societies. That has happened throughout history, and that's why I feel confident about the Balts and the Poles at this point. Not only that they're in NATO, but they've actually done something to build well-ordered societies. Ukraine has been a mess, if we were honest with ourselves, for the past 25 years. Back when Crimea was taken over, we thought of this as a corrupt oligarch political system. Yeah, there were elements of civil society, some elements of real democratic desires in Ukraine, but it was never consolidated as a system. That's what we should have focused on. And if we had consolidated or helped Ukraine consolidate as a genuinely democratic society, put its own house in order, we would have had much an easier time dealing with the challenge that Russia is posing to us right now.
But the irony is that that's when the invasion happened, when actually the Ukrainian people started to insist, we don't want corruption, we want to be more like Poland, we want to join the EU, and they went to the Maidan and demonstrated and basically caused the government to collapse and the Putin-backed Yanukovych to run off to Moscow. So they actually were getting their act together, and they have been steadily getting their act together. And if they had a collective security agreement, they might actually have the incentive, and certainly EU membership, they would have the requirement to become less corrupt, although frankly, we've seen backsliding in Hungary and other countries.
Yeah, well, that's why Ukraine wants the EU connection, but also Ukraine's a very different country today than it was even 2014, 2016, having spent time there a lot before the full-scale invasion and after. But I want to get through some more questions, so we'll speed through this. Evelyn, why don't you take this one? Could Beijing conclude that the United States is not willing to sustain support for an ally or partner under siege, such as Ukraine? And I'm going to add to your question out there, and could that affect or encourage Beijing to go after Taiwan?
Absolutely. I was just in Ukraine a couple weeks ago, where I think I got the sinus infection coming back. So I don't blame the Ukrainians, but it's a lot of travel to get to Ukraine for 2 days and back. And in February, I was at the Munich Security Conference, and then I was in Taipei. The Taiwanese are absolutely, they're fearful. They see what's been happening with this weird diplomacy and with Russia seeming to get a pass from the United States and this permissiveness. And they understand that if Ukraine is not supported, if Russia is not deterred and stopped in Ukraine, China will take that as a green light towards Taiwan. And we have seen increased Chinese activity just over the last several months, indicating that they're testing this proposition. We don't know what Xi will do. We don't know what his timeline is. We know that he's not as much of a risk taker as Vladimir Putin, so he might be less inclined to test his military, which he doesn't trust. But having said that, if he thinks that we're not going to come to Taiwan's or to Ukraine's defense, he will conclude that we're not likely to come to Taiwan's defense either. I think that would be a dangerous miscalculation for him to make, I have to add, because just as we have bipartisan support in the Congress to protect or to defend Ukraine and its sovereignty, we have a similar bipartisan support for Taiwan. Now, again, the
probably
biggest,
even more, to be honest.
Probably more, and the biggest question, of course, is the White House and what the president would decide. But at the end of the day, the principle is the same because it has to do with changing political affiliations and borders through use of force.
Tom Graham, let me keep us moving here. Next question from the audience: what options for U.S.-Russia relations open up if Putin is no longer the leader? Are there any options other than his death?
So what's the question again?
What options for U.S.-Russia relations open up if Putin is no longer the leader?
No Putin.
No Putin. And are there any options for those relations opening up other than his death?
Okay, to answer the first question, I think we need to realize that a successor to Putin will be a Russian nationalist, and he will think in terms of Russian national interests, much the way former or previous Russian leaders have. And that means it's going to continue to be a difficult relationship and a rivalry of some sort. I think it'll be different and positive from our standpoint because Putin, in many ways, is not a typical Russian leader any longer. He has taken a messianic turn and has, I think, an exaggerated opinion of himself and the role that Russia plays on the global stage. Having a pragmatic Russian leader opens up opportunities to deal on a whole range of issues where our interests overlap. European security, the Arctic, for example. There are things that we can do commercially. There are ways that we could work together in the Middle East and elsewhere. So I would welcome that. Do these opportunities open up as long as Putin's in power? A short answer is it's going to be a lot easier with a successor. But the reality is that we have to deal with Russia now, and Putin is in charge, and you have to figure out a way of doing this to protect our interest and try to build that constructive competitive coexistence that I talked about. I don't rule that out. I think that's possible, but it requires a much more subtle policy than this administration is prepared or capable of developing at this point.
So-
We've only, okay.
Can I just say one thing
Sure.
about that? I think that if you push the war to the point where Putin's military leaders and the elites around him, the security folks, the so-called Siloviki, go to him and they say, we are done, then it is possible that he could be forced to take a more pragmatic approach.
But is that
nobody will
realistically
trust
or
Putin.
possible militarily? Can you get there militarily?
I think it would be very hard given the current situation, but I think it's worth a try, and you should certainly not exclude, because I do believe that sanctions can work and we can put more forceful sanctions on Russia and we can isolate them more diplomatically. The more pressure we put on Putin, the better likelihood we get. I don't think we can count on it, but maybe he could be forced to be more pragmatic. The reality, though, is that I don't think anyone would trust him.
He could be pushed from power.
Yeah,
I mean,
and go to the dacha.
There are other ways of being pushed from power in Russia.
Yeah. Usually not to the dacha. But he could do a Yeltsin, right? He could,
look,
Fall off a balcony while smoking.
a Russian
through a window, usually.
A Russian ruler has 3 tasks. He needs to defend the country against external enemies. He needs to defend the elite against the masses, and he needs to defend the elite against themselves. If you can stymie what Putin is trying to do on the battlefield in Ukraine and demonstrate that he's not protecting you against foreign enemies, that the economic problems are increasing the unrest or displeasure within the population, then the elites find a way of finding a new ruler. So I don't rule that out. I think it's something that we need to bear in mind. It's difficult to forecast something like this, but the one thing I'm certain of is something like this happens, we will know right after Putin knows.
All right, we're out of time, but I do want to just very, very quick answers and try your best with these. Evelyn, what is your opinion? Is this ultimately Europe's business and Ukraine's business?
No, it's the world's business. It's about the international order.
Will Russia/Putin ever let the war in Ukraine end?
Yes.
Why?
Because we create conditions in which it's in their interest to let the war in Ukraine end and build a more constructive relationship with the United States.
Good. Okay, so we are going to bring the question back up. This is the time where we see who has been moved, who's been persuaded during this debate. Once again, should the United States continue to view Russia as an adversary? And while the Jeopardy music plays, Evelyn Farkas, give us one thing, or 2 things if you want, that Tom Graham said that was compelling and or surprised you.
Compelling or surprising? Well, there were, I wasn't terribly surprised. I've debated Tom before, so I wasn't surprised. I think I liked how he put out just now the 3 things that a Russian leader needs to make sure that he, and it's always he achieves. Oh, Catherine, right.
Exactly, it's been a while, but
yeah.
Not always.
So I think that's compelling and is worth thinking about. Surprising, I don't think.
So I gave you and or, it's fine. Okay. Tom Graham, what was surprising and or compelling that Evelyn Farkas said?
The litany of things that Putin has done against us was a lot longer than I had thought. So that, I think, was surprising. Look, I'd be the first to admit that Putin's a problem here. And I think Evelyn drove that point home quite forcefully. My sense is you have to deal with reality, and maybe I'm a bit more optimistic or naive about how you can manage a relationship with Putin, but I would be the last to say that he isn't a problem for us and will continue to be a problem as long as he has this messianic view of himself and Russia's role in the world.
And I guess one more question as we wait for the bar graph to be ready. You know, about a year and a half ago, the British and the Germans and the French came out with statements that were based, according to the people I talked to, on the math of what Russia was producing, its military. And the statement said very specifically that Russia will be our adversary for a generation. And the point was that they believed that beyond Putin, the Russian industrial complex was reconstituting itself such that Western Europe would be threatened. And the capitals, the intelligence agencies of all three countries, alongside the Biden administration, released that statement. Do you agree with that?
No. Look, I mean, defense industrial people tend to exaggerate the threat because it has a bearing on their budget. Look, I mean, you know, you need to do or take the steps necessary to defend yourself. But I don't think you need to exaggerate the challenge that Russia is going to face or pose to us over the long term. It is a country that has deep problems that have been exacerbated by this conflict. Russia will be in a worse strategic position as a result of this. It'll be caught between a united Europe and a robustly growing China with an industrial base that is well beyond, in terms of technological capabilities, than you need to compete effectively in the 21st century. So, you know, I think there's a tendency to exaggerate the challenge. I think we ought to have the confidence that we have the capabilities, the resources to manage this Russia challenge effectively. But what we need is the political will and the confidence in our own systems. And that is what has suffered because of the domestic disarray that you see throughout Europe and the United States today.
Yeah.
So,
Can I just add one little thing to that? Because I actually agree with Tom here that there is a tendency to over-exaggerate. We exaggerated, you know, what was going to happen to Ukraine. And right now, Russia has an interest rate of 21%. They have inflation at 10%. 9% of their GDP is being provided to fuel the defense economy, except they don't have enough manpower, and I mean manpower. They're using women to make ammunition in Kazan, in one of their big defense facilities. They've militarized the country. They have young people, children, not just marching, but I suspect probably also involved in the defense industry. So that demonstrates actually a fragility, and they don't have foreign reserves. Again, if we keep the sanctions and make them even more effective, that can continue to squeeze how much they have economically. The problem is, where they're right in these intelligence assessments, is that because Russia has this wartime economy now that's putting people to work and paying people to fight, paying people to make these, you know, munitions, that actually means that Putin, if he stays in power, or whoever succeeds him, is going to have a problem if they don't have a war to fight. If they have a peace,
when all you have is a hammer,
and
everything is a nail.
And you have post-Afghanistan, you know, we already see the veterans coming home, especially those convicts, and killing again in the Russian villages. We see already the PTSD and all of the impact that it's having.
Yeah, and we haven't even talked about Wagner and the kind of mercenaries. All right, so here we go, bar graph. Results, wow. You guys were unpersuasive, apparently. All right, so should the United States continue to view Russia as an adversary? Before we started talking, 87% said yes, 13% said no. Afterward, 86%. So 1% of you moved, and afterward, 14%, which is probably within the margin of error. But thank you both.
And maybe someone left.
Exactly. Thank you both for a fabulous debate, in my opinion, and thank you all for being here.